Welcome to another one-on-one on Talking Feds. With the election approaching, we're going to do special one-on-ones focusing on each of the 6 or so swing states that are so decisive, so very much the subject of intense campaigning and coverage by each of the campaigns. And we're starting today with our first one, the great state of Wisconsin. And we're very lucky to be joined by Zac Schultz. He's a reporter and occasional anchor for Here and Now, which is PBS Wisconsin's weekly news program covering state issues and politics. Also produces stories for PBS Wisconsin's Wisconsin Life Project, has won numerous awards for the coverage of Wisconsin politics, and even some for his coverage of the lighter side of news. Maybe we'll get to that. Anyway, Zac Schultz, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. So, of course, we've had this dramatic development that maybe has changed things on the ground, and we had campaign events. But let's just start with Wisconsin. So what makes it so, you could say, purple, so much a swing state? Looking at it overall, what puts it on the sort of razor's edge that it's on?
It's just got real solid divisions between the two parties that are long-standings. And even when there's been political realignment, as we've seen around the country with working class whites or suburban moms, that seems to happen within an election cycle of each other, so that it still remains, even if one group goes one way and the other comes back across, that Democrats and Republicans are about evenly divided. And then there is just a stubborn streak down the middle of Wisconsin, the independent swing voters, those that go with who would they want to have a beer with, or who do they trust in their gut, who is their neighbor like. Those all matter in Wisconsin still, especially in the middle of the state that is farther away from the big media centers of Madison and Milwaukee, where small town politics still matters, where just people know each other very closely for life.
Yeah, so it's that geography. I'm from Pennsylvania, and it's famously said that Pennsylvania is Pittsburgh to the west, Philadelphia to the east, and Alabama in between. So we think of Milwaukee, where the Republican convention was just held. We think of Madison, and then a really big, you could either say rural, but certainly much more sparsely populated. Can you bring home the division or the parity you just described in terms of geography, age, race, how, especially given that it's stable over the years in Wisconsin, how does it kind of stack up that you get to this 50-50 bottom line perennially?
Well, if you look at a map of the state, you draw a line from Green Bay, where the Packers are, most people know where Green Bay is, up by the Door County Peninsula, down to about Madison, which is south-central part of the state. Everything to the south and east going towards Milwaukee, that's about 2/3 of the state's population, and that less than half of the state. So everything,
including Milwaukee, that 2/3?
Yep, including
okay.
Milwaukee.
Uh-huh.
So if you go to the north and west of that imaginary line, that is only 1/3 of the population, but it is a lot of the farmland in Wisconsin. It is a lot of the Northwoods. It is sparsely populated. There are strong community centers in a lot of those places, little state college towns that kind of create their own identity, their own fabric, and they are insulated from some of what happens in the broader Milwaukee media market. In Milwaukee itself, it's its own conversation, because there's the city and the county of Milwaukee, which is blue, but not nearly as blue as Dane County and Madison, where it's extremely liberal. But then just outside that, there's a ring of suburban areas that have traditionally been very red, and that is the heart of the traditional establishment Republican Party. That has shifted. That is what's been fascinating, because that area has become slightly more Democratic, and some of those suburban moms in the last 8 years in the Trump era have shifted away. If you go back to 2016, Wisconsin was one of the last states to say no to Trump in that primary. Wisconsin went for Ted Cruz, and it was part of like an establishment push on the part of Republicans to try and find an alternative to Trump, because they did not think he would play. And it was outstate, that north and west part of the state, that strongly supported Trump and carried him over when it came to the fall of 2016, and where the base of his support is now. That is the interior part of the Republican establishment they're coming around on Trump because they know he is the reality of the face of the party. But that is still where the old establishment Republican, Ronald Reagan type era still lies. And it is the outstate Republicans that are all in for Trump, where if you drive around, you're going to see the Trump flags on houses, on barns, in yards, and you won't see as much of that towards the other part of the state, the more densely populated.
Got it. And I want to move for a second to the 2020 election, but I think of the Milwaukee convention as really representing the full rise and capture by Trump of the party at the expense of, for example, Reagan Republicans, and who are, if anything, Mitch McConnell on the enemies list, but really the apotheosis of Trump and Trumpism. How does that dynamic, Reagan Republicans versus Trump Republicans, play in today's Wisconsin?
The shift has been complete. The last two prominent Wisconsin Republican governors, Scott Walker from 2010 to 2018, right, and Tommy Thompson, who was an icon in Wisconsin politics from 86 to when he moved to the George W. Bush administration in Washington, those two governors are now all in for Trump, and they were not. It was back in 2016 when Scott Walker himself was running for president against Trump in that primary. He dropped out early, and when he dropped out, he said, I'm trying to form a movement to get others to drop out so we can consolidate around an anti-Trump candidate. That never happened. But he was one of those that was leading the Cruz train back in 2016 to stand up to Trump. He is now all in on Trump, as is the rest of the party establishment. They realize that that's where their base is in Wisconsin, and that's where their future as a party lies for right now.
Got it. Boy, so many stories like that. Okay, so 2020 then. I mean, you've described a pretty static parity between Republicans and Democrats. So in a given election, let's say this one, but also 2020, the decisive cadre of voters is what? The narrow stripe in between? Is it turnout? What tends to be the focus of the parties given where they begin with so many voters presumably decided and so few in play?
Well, that depends on when they're talking and who they're talking to. Because if they're going to be in the media, they're going to talk about swing voters and independents in Wisconsin. But the reality is when they're talking about their ground game in the fall, it's enthusiasm and turnout. What we have seen over and over and over, dating back to the early 2000s, is whichever party does not get their base and their enthusiasm out loses. They lose, whether it's Senate elections or gubernatorial elections or presidential elections. Certainly in 2016, which was the first time since the Reagan era that Wisconsin went for a Republican, the statewide level in a presidential election. It was because voter turnout among Democrats was way down, especially compared to the Obama era, but even compared to like John Kerry and Al Gore, 20 years, 16 years before that. And it was simply Democrats were not enthusiastic enough. They did not turn out. You can argue it was swing voters. And yes, when you've got 10 to 20,000 vote margins, it is everybody. It's almost every category matters. But
no, but I think that's really trenchant of you. Although it's interesting that you put it, whichever doesn't get their turnout loses. I mean, I'm thinking of, say, neighboring Ohio, where the Trump, where the numbers were the normal ones plus bigger turnout by Republicans. So you see it more as one part. Like, well, what happened in 2020, basically, by your analysis?
In 2020, we saw enough of a realignment among suburban former Republican voters, the soccer moms, so-called, in those suburban counties outside the Milwaukee area that swung to Democrats and Joe Biden, and there was not the drop-off in the core Democratic areas for Joe Biden as we saw with Hillary Clinton. Clinton's numbers crashed in 2016 compared to Obama in 2008 and 2012. That's kind of inevitable. I mean, Obama was in that one of those realignment, perfect storms. If he caught the remainder of the white working class vote in 2008 and it was completely dissipated by 2012, it was gone by 2016. So whether that was Clinton lost them or they just were already Republicans by then, you can argue the semantics of that, but they were gone. And she didn't have enough of the base that got revved up in Madison, Dane County, and in Milwaukee County in 2020. And we saw really high turnout in Dane County, which is the heart of the UW campus. Young voters turned out in amazing margins. Milwaukee County had really good margins, and they did just enough peeling away some of those suburban, formerly Republican areas that Joe Biden was able to win it by a very narrow margin again.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the present exciting and tumultuous days. So Harris, with a nod to the importance of Wisconsin, holds one of her second rally there, and is on the one hand leads with abortion rights, but on the other, the middle class economic message of Biden and Biden's record. So what was your sense? I know I'll stipulate, it's hard to make a lot of sense of this now because we're on a sort of sugar high for Kamala Harris, but as best you could tell, how did her both messaging and sort of personal qualities resonate with Wisconsin voters?
Well, I think that the sugar high description is accurate for now, and the question is whether that sugar high runs through November or if it fades out once we get into the dog days of August, into the key parts in September and October. But the enthusiasm shift was overnight, it was immediate, and it was actually a little stunning. After the debate, after Joe Biden's debate performance, he did make an appearance in Madison, Wisconsin. It's one of those places he could go to, or you're always welcome in Dane County among the liberals there. Yeah. And people went, he filled the gym, but it was not in the sense of, oh, we're so excited to see Joe Biden. More from the sense I got from people who were there or around it was, we're going to show our support because it's necessary for him to see our support, for the world to see our support. And Republicans were actually crowing and saying, well, if he can't even get that kind of enthusiasm in Dane County, he's done. Because that's where presidential candidates always came to get their big image of Obama filling, Bascom Hill and tens of thousands, and John Kerry, 100,000 people outside the Capitol in 2004. And the fact that Joe Biden was coming here in the middle of summer and still just filling a middle school gym, Republicans were very happy and Democrats were worried about. Flip that to Tuesday, and it was a completely different scenario. The gym was alive, people were packed in there, and the enthusiasm just took off. I mean, Harris's campaign has put out all the numbers, but even beyond that, on the ground, just the frame of mind among Democrats. When I was in Milwaukee for the RNC, there was just pins and needles day by day as that convention went on of Democrats wondering, like, oh gosh, is Joe actually going to stay in? What does this mean? Can they turn it around? To where it was a breath of fresh air for a lot of Democrats. I had one email me on Sunday and just say, boom. That was all he had to say. That was his message. We have been communicating about what's going to happen. And for him, that was the moment. And he wasn't even one of those advocating for Joe Biden to get out. He was simply worried about what the optics would mean and whether everyone would be able to rally around the old flag. And now there's a new flag. And so far on the ground, it's made a difference.
And so it's so good to talk to you about this, Zach, because there's this intangible quality in politics. The very early polls still have Trump. It's within margin of error, but up by a few. But I'm getting from you the sense that, like, on the ground, there was really a feeling of electricity and the possibility of real growth. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely. And when it comes to turnout in Wisconsin, it is entirely about enthusiasm. If your party's excited, they will do doors, they will activate their neighbors, and that's what makes the difference in just about every campaign, nonpartisan, partisan, national, state, local.
And I think it's arguable, by the way, that her entry now makes this more of a turnout kind of election. But let's go. I mean, you had an enthusiastic crowd in Milwaukee. You were there. So now sort of shift our focus, or turn around to the Republicans there, and maybe it's changed or blunted a little by Harris, but did you equally sense, qua Wisconsin, I mean, it's the national convention, but did you sense a similar kind of excitement and enthusiasm among Republican voters, both at the convention, and maybe has it abided these last few days as Harris has entered into the race?
Look, during the convention, absolutely. It's the most unified that I've ever seen the Wisconsin Republican Party in my time covering it. I mean, we can go back 20 years to the last time that they were all in on one candidate. And that is the shift that's occurred, is that they are unified. It is the old guard has gotten on board and the new people up and coming. I mean, one of the stories I was working on was about young Republicans. And they are all in for Trump. When you ask them about the age differences of how young Democrats don't really like Joe Biden's age is at the same with young Republicans liking Donald Trump's age, and they're absolutely not. They saw no comparison between that. So they were as excited as you can imagine. They were happy to see Vance on the ticket because they represented a new era for them, especially for some of those young Republicans. But the delegation breakfast every morning for the Wisconsin Republicans was just as enthusiastic and excited as I've seen in a long time. I have not been able to speak with them one-on-one since then, in the last few days since that announcement. The timing's all running in consecutive. So the first things that I've seen on social media and some of the reports is it looks like they're just trying to ride the wave, weather the storm for the moment, and hopefully
you want to
equilibrium.
Duck. And I do a little surfing out in City, and we call it a turtle. And go over. Yeah, but you had a great interview with Kyle Schroeder, the head of the Wisconsin Republican Party, and it did reflect all that. So let's focus on that, because there's also an indication that at least nationwide, exactly this cadre of 18 to 34-year-old voters have jumped into the pool with Harris there. To the extent there's a, battle between enthusiastic Wisconsin young Republicans and enthusiastic Wisconsin young Democrats, what will the battle be joined? Is there a way of analyzing young voters as a whole by issues that give a sense of, who's gonna win that big prize?
Well, I think from the Republican point of view, they are worried about inflation and the ability to buy a home, and for young people to start the next phase of their lives. The young Republicans in Wisconsin specifically are a post-college Republican organization designed to carry some of those kids out that have graduated, because the state party is a little bit older and there wasn't always a home where they felt comfortable for young professionals in their late 20s and early 30s to feel ready to reside in a Republican Party establishment. And this is where they want them to be, and they're focused on those issues of, can you afford to buy a house? And right now in Wisconsin, that's difficult for anyone of any age. I mean, same nationwide, but Wisconsin is under a housing crunch, especially when you look at the parts of the state that have the jobs where people want to live. Interest rates have not come down. The inflationary process that hit you at the grocery store, hit you everywhere else, are still there. And that is where they are banking on being able to convince young voters that there's a difference with Republicans. When it comes to the Democrats, a lot of the strategy is yet to occur, because a lot of it takes place when the students come back to campuses in the fall. So when September comes around, that's part of our coverage, is we plan on being out with them to see what is that strategy like in the dorms? How are they recruiting on campus? How are they organizing? And that is where enthusiasm matters. Because we've seen elections where, the clerks here are designed, they have to kind of approximate turnout. And so they print that many ballots. They don't print one for every possible voter. And there are elections where all of a sudden they're having to print them day of, because that many students, especially in some of these dorms, are turning out. And that's something that only happens in the last few weeks, as some of these kids get tuned into campus, find their rhythm, and then decide, I'm activated. In Wisconsin, it's a same-day registration state. So they can wait all the way up until Election Day, and I've seen it. I've been in the dorms on Election Day where the line for kids to go register to vote is longer than the line it is to cast the ballot. That is their first step. They have someone at the door saying, register, you're over there. Go to that one.
Some pizza, whatever. Yeah, it's amazing how mercurial that can be with young voters in particular. Okay, so we'll find out about the Dems. You have a good sense of the Republicans. So this independent stratum in between, do we have a sense from 2020 or now about what decisive issues will be, and the kind of wrestling match the national parties will be having for their support?
Well, I'd be remiss not to consider abortion as one of the key issues here in Wisconsin for both parties. So what happened when the Dobbs decision came down is Wisconsin reverted back to a statehood era law from the 1840s that basically banned
Amazing,
all
right?
abortion.
Yeah.
And
That's a whole legal point, but
Yes. And so there are two cases running concurrently that are going before the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which just in the last year, based on abortion
itself, has had all kinds,
flipped. And now
I was peremptory there. Please explain in a couple sentences the whole Wisconsin Supreme Court brouhaha. It's important here.
Yes. And it's the deciding factor in a lot of issues, including how we vote and who gets to vote, because it oversees a split legislature, or a legislature and a governor not of the same party, where laws don't get passed. So it's the Supreme Court that often has to decide these issues, or a federal court on some voting issues. But in 2023, a liberal won, running pretty much unabashedly on pro-abortion rights, the most expensive Supreme Court race for the state in national history. $50 million spent on that one race. That flipped the majority. Liberals controlled the court for the first time in nearly 15 years, and they have wasted no time in putting a lot of more liberal rulings into place, overturning some very recent conservative ones. A couple of the cases that are before the court right now have to do with that abortion law. One being, should that law be overturned on its own? And the second one, is there a constitutional right to abortion under Wisconsin's constitution? There have not scheduled oral arguments, but they're likely to happen in the fall. Briefing is going on this summer. It's a possibility that we get a decision around Election Day, and that's a question that some politicals are going to have. If abortion becomes a settled issue before Election Day, does it still have the turnout energy? Or can they still get people to realize that, well, there's a national threat to abortion issues as well, and that's what the Dems will use for turnout. But abortion has strong support in Wisconsin and always has. It was always in the mid-60s for support for some abortion rights in polling for the last few decades. That's remained constant. What was the case was prior to Dobbs, people didn't always vote that way. There were lots of Republicans who voted for Republicans on other issues that did not vote based on abortion. And now some of them are rethinking that stance and what is the most important deciding factor for them to vote. And that is something that the Dems have used for the last few election cycles to surge their turnout, especially swinging some votes in some of these formerly Republican areas.
Let's, this is all fascinating, and especially because it seems to be a work in progress. I want to close, Zac, with my observation of what you're saying. Do I have it right? So in 2020, even 2016, relentless focus, it seemed like, there were 6 voters and you'd go to their bowling, whatever, so narrow and sometimes like, wow, these are the people who are going to be deciding for us, et cetera, and just crazy emphasis on them, and it really being important to understand the difference between a national election, one that essentially comes down to such a small percentage of U.S. voters. I hear you suggesting that maybe as a concomitant of Harris's coming into the race and hearkening back to Obama and the like, that possibly Wisconsin has shifted overnight, or actually maybe it's always been more this way than the national focus has understood, to a turnout election. That is, that her entry gives the Democrats a different kind of focus from getting 6 out of 11 of those swing voters, whoever they are, and more toward really turning out the base, including African-American base, not, student, young base, non-traditional. Is that fair assessment of what am I characterizing what you're saying fairly? And B, can you talk about it a little bit more in terms of its connection to the strategy and tactics we're going to be seeing in Wisconsin from the parties in the next few months?
Yeah, definitely. So there's 3 million voters in Wisconsin that turn out for a presidential election typically. And when you have a turnout that's typically in the mid-70s, one of the highest in the nation, in part to same-day registration and that access to the ballot, when you drop down a few percentage points, that's all the difference you need when we're talking about statewide wins of 11,000, 16,000, or 20,000 votes, which is what we've seen outside of Barack Obama. Every other election comes down to the narrowest of margins. So in that respect, any group you look at can be the decisive one. But when I look back at the margins, the drop off from election to election, that usually to me signals which party didn't get their candidates out. And here's the evidence I'll give you that the parties themselves understand enthusiasm. Just like last week during the RNC, the state GOP chairman, Brian Schimming, every morning pretty much, when speaking to his breakfast delegation for the Wisconsin members, would talk about the enthusiasm gap that existed in polling, showing there was like a 40-point difference between Republicans enthusiastic about voting for Donald Trump versus Democrats for Joe Biden. And he kept hitting that point over and over, to the point where by the end of the week, he was reminding them, don't be overconfident. We still have to go out and win. We still have to go out and do the doors. They were using the convention as a springboard to send these delegates and activists and volunteers back to their communities and get them organized and get them excited. Democrats did not have that, but that shifted overnight by Tuesday. We've seen that in Wisconsin. When people are excited and energized, they vote. And part of it is because in some of these small communities that may go one way more than the other, that if some of the parties don't think that the election will be close, they don't vote for anywhere on the ticket. I've spoken to the volunteers who organized in some conservative areas for 2008 and Barack Obama, and they said they got more just by going out and rallying their neighbors and saying, hey, Democrats do exist here. They got more votes in that one election than they'd seen for a Democratic candidate in the last 5 combined, simply because no one had gone and knocked down those doors before. So when you have that excitement, you have more volunteers, that can make all the difference. And we've seen it in statewide elections for nonpartisan races. There was a Supreme Court candidate, a conservative, who was actually abandoned by some of the traditional Supreme Court like business lobby groups that simply had a stronger mobilization activism on day one, and he did the polls. He beat them. And he's still sitting on the Supreme Court today. So it matters when you're talking about doors. And you've talked to Ben Wickler from the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. He's constantly talking about how the small dollar donations get turned into people doing doors. They were doing doors even for Joe Biden during the RNC as their response. They didn't have people coming into Media Row to do interviews. They were trying to get people out in the communities to go knock doors as their counter message.
So interesting, and in a way kind of wholesome. I mean, back to basics of really knocking on doors, even in 2024 with the growth of AI and social media, et cetera. Zac Schultz, thanks so much for being with us and for your invaluable on the ground vantage point. We'll be looking at Wisconsin, as will everyone else, very, very closely in coming months, and perhaps have the chance to talk to you again.
All right. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.